I love the review for two reasons. It helps set the table for what's next. And then it helps to let us see what we may not be as strong on or not know. We're continuing our study of Genesis, and we're taking this big picture look. And what we're going to do today is we're going to get a micro look. And what I mean by that, the same way that we put that outline together for the big picture of the Bible, we had those 6 sections, those 66 books, and we identified them. Now we're going to go and we're going to take a big picture look at Genesis, which we're already doing. But I'm just going to show you guys what I mean when I tell you guys that we're creating that map and then we're identifying points to fill in on that map. Okay, and then we'll pick up where we left off last week in the book of Genesis, studying the life of Joseph and these 12 sons, this crazy family. Let's start off with some scripture reading from Genesis 12. Genesis 12. Good morning. Grab you some papers there, first 2 pages. For Genesis 12. Going to be a lot of writing this morning. Hopefully y'all have pens. If not, I might be able to let you borrow one.
Might, huh?
Yep. The mic is just because I don't know how many I have.
I like a college teacher. I might give you one, I might not.
I think I got a few extras if somebody needs a pen. Let me know when y'all got the 12 pulled up. I'm going to pull it up here. Sometimes I like to turn the pages. Sometimes I like to do the quick version. Everybody there? Okay. Let me get there. I'm not there. All right. Now verse 1. Now the Lord said to Abram, and I'm reading from the English Standard Version. The Lord said to Abram, said to who? Abram, not Abraham yet. He's still Abram. Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation. Okay, if you underline in your Bible, underline nation. I will bless you and make your name great. Underline name if you write in your Bible, or if you're making notes, write it somewhere on your page. I will bless those who bless you. Underline bless, and in him who dishonors you, I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. May the Lord add a blessing to the readers, hearers, and doers of his word. We'll leave it right there. Okay. So a while back, I told you all that the whole narrative in the book of Genesis, and really throughout all of the Old Testament, hangs his hat on this promise in Genesis 12, 1, 3. Okay. And as we make this big picture, this is one of those that we got to understand not only what it entails, but where it's located. Okay. When we quote scripture, you don't have to know the entire Bible verbatim. You don't have to know every single chapter and verse that every single catchy quote or phrase comes from. But as a sound, biblical-minded Christian, there's certain ones you got to be able to go and point your hat to. Okay, and as we create that map that we were talking about, that Bible management system, this is one of them, specifically for the book of Genesis, because as we'll see, everything in Genesis revolves kind of around this promises. It links 2 important periods in the book of Genesis together that lead up to kind of where we are with Joseph. Does that make sense? Okay. So if Genesis 12, 1 and 3 is the focus, we're calling it the focus of Genesis, then what chapters do we have before Genesis 12? It's not a hard question. New, what chapters come before 12? 1 through 11, right? 1 through 11. So I'm going to write 1 through 11 here. Okay? And what do we have after 12? 13 through 50. Through 50. Okay? And that don't beat yourself up if you don't know that there's 50 books in Genesis. Okay? Not important. But as you start looking in, as you get this big picture, and we're actually going to start this at 12 because we stopped at verse 3. So I'm going to put chapters 12 through 50. Okay? But as you start looking in and filling in this map that we're putting together, you'll start to see and you'll start to catch on to where certain things are located. Okay? Certain stories that we've hit, some we haven't touched yet. You'll be able to put a place, a mental marker in your mind. Okay, that's there. This is here. This is what happened in this part. Okay? I might not be able to explain to you every single detail, but here's what happened in 1 through 11. Here's the big picture that the writer was trying to paint for. Okay? Here's the message that the writer, who many believe to be Moses, paints for us in 12 through 50. Does that make sense? Now, we've discussed some of these things, okay, in chapter 1:11. What's some of the key people, the key stories that we saw in chapters 1 through 11? What's the very first thing that we see in Genesis, the first big story? Adam and Eve, creation. Okay, chapters 1 through 2 tells the story of Adam. Adam is the Hebrew word, the Hebrew name for Adam. Guess what that means? Humanity. And Eve, the Hebrew name for Eve, means life. So God created humanity and life, and he created the earth. Okay, and he ordained and he gave humanity the task of going and filling this earth and being stewards over this great earth that he created. Okay, if you guys have your notes, I want you guys to fill in this portion that we're doing now, kind of on, and I apologize, I should have told you guys before you start writing, on this page with the spider. I apologize. If you already started writing where you are, you're good, but save the space you have, but start filling in these notes on the page with the spider. Okay, so we have creation. That's our first big picture. That's our first landmark on the map. I love drawing maps. In youth church last week, we drew maps of Egypt and Israel. The kids kept saying, that looked like Kentucky and Indiana. That don't look like Egypt. I'm a bad artist. I'm sorry. All right. So when we build this map, we know that one of our first landmark stops is creation. Okay, what's another story that we've talked about thus far? Say again? Covenant. Okay? The covenant. And when we talk about the covenant, we're going to get into that some because the covenant came, there's a bunch of covenants. There's an Abrahamic covenant. There's a nomadic. Yeah, Noah had a covenant, right? Some kind of addict that started with Noah, right? There was a covenant between Noah. What was that covenant all about? What? Promised that he wouldn't destroy the world again. How did he destroy it, or to begin with? The flood. The flood. Chapter 6, the flood. Noah. But before we even get to the flood, what happened? This world was great. It was a great place. It was heaven. God's presence was there. We were in perfect harmony as humanity in life with the rest of creation. We were in our God-given place. And then all of a sudden, we start to see this downward spiral that started to happen. What started the downward spiral? Sin. What was the original sin? Eating the fruit, the fall, right? Genesis 3, the fall. The fall. And we won't go all the way into the fall in chapter 3, but know this, that God had always told humanity in life, Adam and Eve, what was good for them. They were given an opportunity, a choice to define what was good and evil for themselves. And instead of accepting what God has deemed was good for them, they took it upon themselves to say, we're going to define what's good and evil for ourselves. They had a little temptation as well on that from another party. But once they made that decision, it introduced some things that started us in this downward spiral. It introduced death. It introduced pain, struggle, shame. Humanity, man and woman, humanity used to be able to walk amongst one another without any shame. But now, once this sin happened, we felt we had a need to be covered and clothed. So a lot of things were introduced into the world that caused us to go into this downward spiral that eventually left to God flooding the earth in chapter 6. What's some other things that happened in chapter 1 through 11 that we've talked about? One we kind of talked about, but we didn't go deep into. A couple of them. We had Cain and Abel. Cain and Abel. The first murder. Yep. Okay, we saw that sin introduced murder. So obviously, if the flood was in 6 and the fall of Adam and Eve was in chapter 3, Cain and Abel was in between 3 and 6, right? You had a guy named Lamech, okay, who had many wives, and he wanted to collect wives and a bunch of other things that were not godlike. In chapter 11, we saw the first corporate sin. Anybody remember what the first corporate sin was? Tower of Babel. Tower of Babel, chapter 11. Okay? And so what we started finding as human began to sin, God has started having to implement judgment. He flooded the earth. In Babel, what happened after they tried to build that tall tower? What did he do to them? He confused their languages and scattered them all over the place. So we start to see judgment. Here's the question. How does God fix it? How does he fix it? Okay? How does he fix it? And what we start to see in chapters 12 through 50, he zeroes in on one family that he's going to use to fix it all, to restore it all. As chapter 11 closes, you start to see genealogies that lead to a tribe that ultimately leads to Abram. In chapter 12, you start to see that promise that starts opening up the rest of the book of Genesis that starts telling the story of this family. So when I'm painting that big picture, am I good to erase this here? Okay. We're gonna take our time. We're not gonna rush. I've lost the marker top. That's why I always run out of markers, because I lose the top.
No, I grabbed the top.
You always saving me, girl. You always saving me. We need help. That's why humanity needs life. You ever got hear me say humanity needs life? I'm saying Adam needed Eve. Right? Adam and Eve are the English names, but the Hebrew names for them mean humanity and life. Humanity is nothing without life. God breathed life into humanity. You women can be our life. I'm not gonna say the other part of my head. I love you. You good? Good, brother? All right. So we have the downward spiral. Basically, we can look at chapter 1 through 11 as if chapter 1 through 11 tells the story of God and the rest of the world. Okay? It's not really focused on one family. There are some people we hit, Adam, Noah, but for the most part, big picture, Genesis 1 through 11, and this is what you can write on this page. Okay? At the top, put chapters 1 through 11. In that box, put the story of God and the whole world. Okay? God and the whole world. We know on the second page, we know that story consists of creation, it consists of the flood, it consists of the first murder, it consists of things, but big picture wise, this chapters 1 through 11 tell the story of God and the whole world. Okay? (12 through 50) tells the story, and really the rest of the Old Testament. But in 12 through 50, it tells the story of God in Abraham's family. Here's how he's going to fix this downward spiral of a mess that humanity created for itself through God and Abraham's family. And it's all tied together with chapter 12, verse 1 and 3, that promise. Okay? The promise that he would make Abraham's name great. When you go back and look at chapter 11, when they were building the Tower of Babel, they were attempting to make their own name great as a nation. Well, God says no. Humanity can't make its own name great. Only I can do that. So God zeroed in on Abraham and said, I'm going to make your name great. I'm going to be a blessing to you in the entire world. If you look at Genesis in chapter 1 and 2 and the creation story, the entire world was blessed. Everything was good. So he's going to restore that blessing, that Eden-like, Garden of Eden-like blessing that was already on the world and humanity. He says, here, humanity, I'm going to zero in on this family to restore the blessing of Eden. Make sense? Okay. Now everybody good with this? Can I erase this? All right. Big picture. That's our big picture for Genesis. It all revolves around the promise in Genesis. Which chapter? Twelve. Genesis 12. Promise to Abraham. Genesis 12. It all zeroes in. It goes around the promise of Abraham in Genesis 12. Okay, that's the link between chapters 1 through 11 in Genesis and chapters 12 through 50. Now, let's get into 12 through 50. Okay, so we're transitioning on your notes to this chart that's broken up into 3 sections. Okay, we're transitioning here. Bingo. Okay. Now, we said there were 50 chapters of Genesis. Chapter 12 is the link. Okay. So let's make a system to manage these other 48 chapters or 38 chapters. Okay. So from chapter 12 to chapter 25, I'm going to say A. So the first half of chapter 25, the writer, Moses, is focusing in on Abraham. Okay. Chapters 25, the second half of 25, and I apologize. To chapter 36, we see the writer focusing on who? Isaac and Jacob. (37 through 50), who's the writer focusing on? The 12 sons, and there's one specific son that gets a lot of the attention. Who was that? Joseph. All right, so we're going to put an asterisk by that 12 sons. We're going to put Joseph. Okay? One thing that you see throughout the entire second half of Genesis is God continues within every generation to, in some way, renew that same promise of 12 to the next man, chosen one, I'll say. Okay, so he did it with Abraham, got the original promise. We see in chapter 26, he reiterated it to Isaac. In chapter 32, we saw Jacob get it iterated to him. And then we see the blessing become through Joseph. And then we're going to see another Jesus pointer in chapter 49 that we'll talk about a little bit. Okay, where the blessing got zeroed in on the tribe of Judah. Okay, but let's fill in some more points on this map, some more destinations. Okay, let's go in our memory banks. What have we talked about so far as Abraham is concerned? What stories have we hit? The changing of his name change. Very good. The promises, okay? After the promise, how did Abraham handle the promise? Did he believe God? He definitely believed God, and he kind of trusted God, but he didn't fully trust God, because what we found out is he betrayed his wife a couple times. He wavered a little bit, and here's how he wavered. He ended up having a partner, a mate, and I got kids in here, I'm trying to say. The Bible uses some little stronger words, right, but he was with another woman, okay, named Hagar. Okay, but even before that, we kind of see that Abraham, he betrayed his wife. That was one we talked about a little bit. Minister Calvin, it kind of alluded to it. He betrays his wife. And he came in a situation where Sarah must have been very attractive, because she was going places and men were coming on to her. Okay, and he made up stories. That's just my sister, that ain't my wife. Fine, if I told somebody you was just my sister, how would you feel about that? I ain't even got to ask that question, do
you? Like to. Stop playing. Let me try to read. Yeah, I'm saying, duh.
And what we see when we go in there and look, that happens in chapter 12. This is shortly after the promise. Chapter 12, and then he does it again in chapter 20. Okay? One thing you got to be aware of as a Bible reader, especially in the Old Testament, a lot of times some people will go to the Bible to try to find examples of how to live, but this chosen family often didn't give us good examples on how to live. They made bad decisions, and that's what I'm kind of showing you here as well. Yeah. They had failures. Yeah, yes. In a lot of instances, they show you what not to do. He betrays his wife in chapter 12 and 20. Okay, he turns around and he's with Sarah in chapter 16. Or Hagar, I'm sorry. I'm just going to say he was with Hagar. Okay? So because of that, God sees this. In chapter 15, God says, listen, Abraham, told you in 12 that I'm going to bless you. I'm going to make a great nation out of you. You're going to have a lot of kids, but you believe me, but you don't trust me because you took it into your own hand. So he made it plain to him by taking that promise and turning that promise into a formal agreement. Here you go, Brother Steve. This is where you're wrong, too. The promise became a formal agreement. And what do we call a formal agreement between God and man? A covenant. Or a covenant promise. Yep. The covenant is the formal agreement. The covenant contains promises. So a lot of times when you're reading through your commentaries and your Bibles and listening to different studies, if you hear somebody say a covenant promise, They're talking about a promise that's tied to a covenant. Okay? And that happened twice. I don't know if y'all picked up on this the first time around. But he made that covenant promise in chapter 15, and then he did it again in chapter 17. And he had to do it again in 17, because if you look at kind of the line here, we saw in 16, they went and took it upon themselves. Okay? Another huge point that we didn't cover, but I want you to add to your notes that you'll see in chapter 17 with the promise, is we saw the sign of the covenant being given to the family of Israel. The sign of the covenant. Anybody have an idea what the sign of the covenant is or was? Circumcision. Chapter 17, he also gave them the sign of the covenant, which was circumcision. This was a reminder. It wasn't just a formality, and we know in today's world, circumcision has health benefits, okay? But for them, this was a sign to the families that you're going to be fruitful, and every time you have a son, I, God, am responsible for your fruitfulness. And here's your reminder. I need you to do this to each boy. Make sense? Okay? So the sign of the covenant, circumcision. And the reason we got to introduce that now is because you see that come up a lot of times when we get to the New Testament. The Jews wrestle over this in 17. Okay? They start talking about, hey, if you're not circumcised, then you're not a Jew, you're a Gentile. And they want to disown people because of that. And then Jesus comes, and we see other places as well where they lose their true circumcision comes where? The heart. Okay? But we got to set that up. Okay? Chapter 22, what big happened in chapter 22? We talked about this one already. By the time of chapter 22, Isaac is already born, but the story still kind of focuses on Abraham. Chapter 22, we had a very big Jesus pointer. Okay, whenever I give you a Jesus pointer, God drops little hints that he's going to send a Savior. The first Jesus pointer, we skipped a little bit. That was in chapter 3. Okay? The next Jesus pointer we see in chapter 22 is the sacrifice of Isaac. Okay? Isaac's sacrifice, which he didn't get sacrificed. Okay? God saved him and intervened. Okay? But that was a sign of what was to come as far as Christ is concerned. Okay? So that's 12 through 25a. Those are the big points that we hit. 12 and 20, Abraham betrays his wife. He sleeps with Hagar at 16. In 15 and 17, God turned the promise of 12, which links the two parts of the book of Genesis together, into a covenant. Okay? Gives them the sign of the covenant, and then we get a Jesus pointer in chapter 22 with Isaac's sacrifice. You guys starting to see what I'm talking about when I say we big picture, draw the map, and then fill in the detail? Okay? When you have these notes, you can take these points, and then when you go to read, sometimes we don't know what to go to read. Say, okay, I want to read on the betrayal, how he betrayed his wife. I'm going to go Genesis 12 and 20. Okay? I want to read about this sign of the covenant thing. Let's jump to 17 and read the details. We got the big pictures. Now we can go dig and get the details. Okay? 25b, Isaac's on the scene. Absolutely.
The only promises was the promise that he was going to give him a child, and the promise of that he was going to make a great nation. Was it enough?
He promised that he would make his name great, that he would bless him, bless those who bless him, curse those who would curse him. Let's read it. I don't want to misquote it. Those weren't the only ones. Okay, I'll paraphrase that. Let's read it. Let's go there. Back to it. Genesis 12. He promised them land as well. Yeah. I don't think I put land up there on the board, but land should be on your papers. Okay? Yeah, he promised them land. That was the big one. Because we found out that they actually ended up in the land. Abraham was in there, and through some of the stories that take place through here, we see them leave the land. And then ultimately, when we get into Joseph, they end up in Egypt. All right, then that's where it sets up for Exodus, where they ended up leaving Egypt to go back to the land that God promised in the beginning. See what I'm saying? I could go on a sermon about that, but I ain't gonna go there. That ain't the purpose. So let's read this real quick. The Lord said to Abraham, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you of a great nation. That's the first one. I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. That's the second one. I will bless those who bless you and dishonor you. Dishonor you, I will curse. And those who dishonor you, I will curse. In some versions, it says, curse those who curse you. And in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Okay, so verse 3, I count that as one blessing. Not only is he going to bless Abraham, but he's going to bless the entire world through Abraham. Okay, and that's the promise of Genesis 12. After that, in verse 4, it says Abraham went. Okay, Abraham went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Okay, so they go. Now, in Genesis 15 and 17, he starts to get deeper on the promises. He starts about giving him as many kids as the stars are numbered and things like that. You see, the promise gets bigger. He starts to make it plain for Abraham because Abraham wasn't content with just verses 1 through 3. That wasn't enough to make him see it. How many times God has to make it plain for you and reiterate a promise and give you some more details? We see it throughout the Bible. When we get to Exodus, you guys are going to really see it. You're going to see it a lot. Can I ask you a question? God bless. All right, so when we left off in 25, we pick up in 25, talk about Isaac and Jacob. In chapter 26, Missionary Jenkins, the promise is, the covenant is renewed with Isaac. Okay. Chapter 27. Chapter 27. Jacob steals Esau's birthright. All right. Jacob, his name, his Hebrew name means what? Deceiver, trickster. 27. Jacob steals Esau's birthright. Okay. 29 through 31. We talked about this the week before last when we started building up to Joseph. Okay. 29 through 21. 27. Is where we start to see the story advance. Jacob tricks Esau in 27. In 29 through 31, Laban tricks Jacob. Okay? And as a result, Jacob ends up with how many wives? This is review. We talked about this already. How many wives did Jacob end up with? He had 2 wives, and let me say it this way. How many baby mamas did he end up with? You say 2?
Ultimately?
Ultimately.
Oh, it was more than 2.
He had 4. Right? Remember, he had Leah and Rachel. He really wanted Rachel.
Yeah.
Laban tricked him into Leah and then sent their servants with him as well. And the one he wanted ended up being the last one he had babies by.
Right.
He had 10 babies by the other 3. And the one he really loved, he couldn't have a baby by until late in the game. Man, that's a message for y'all. I ain't even got to elaborate on it. Y'all can fill in the blanks because it happened to me. Don't happen to all of it, but it happened to me. Yeah, I ain't gonna touch that. So we see in 29 through 31, Laban tricks Jacob. He ends up with 4 baby mamas, 2 wives, 2 concubines. And as a result, it causes all type of jealousy and confusion. Causes all.
What does that say about Jacob's name?
Right here?
No, right there.
Right here?
Yeah.
Jacob steals Esau's birthright. Notice how we're still seeing failure. Okay? We're still seeing failure. Abraham betrayed his wife. Hagar, he sleeps with Hagar. Now we just got blessed here again. You got the promise renewed, and now we already cutting up. We're tricking people and stealing wives and having sex with a bunch of women and having babies everywhere. God said be fruitful and multiply, but he didn't necessarily want it to go down like this. All right? So as a result, you continue to see stories of tragedy, pain, death, okay, that continues to happen. Now, there's a transition in this section of Genesis right around verse 32, Mr. Clark. What happened around Genesis 32?
Oh, man. Hey, right.
Wrestle with God. So 32, we see Jacob wrestling with God. And Jacob was so persistent that God said, you know what? I'm going to bless you, man. This blessing that I gave in 12, this promise I gave in 12 that became a covenant in 15, that I reiterated to Isaac in 26, I'm going to let it flow through you, Jacob. God overlooked everything Jacob did before, stole his birthright, tricked his father, and he said, you know what, you're so persistent with me, God. You wrestled with me so long. I'm God, and you wrestled with me and said, God bless me, and you wouldn't let me go. You clung to me and held on to me so long. Even though you did everything you did in the past, Jacob, guess what? I'm going to bless you. Not only I'm going to bless you, I'm going to change who you are. Because back then, what we're noticing is why I'm giving you the name of Adam, Eve, Jacob. A name meant something. His name meant trickery at first, deceiver. So that's not who you are no more. So I'm going to change you, and I'm going to call you what? Israel. Wrestles with God. And this blessing is going to continue to flow with you. And we ultimately see in 37 through 50, Israel ends up having sons. And we see that branch, because of his persistence with God, the anointing, the flowing, the blessing flowed and branched out to the remainder of his family tree. 12 sons he had. 12 sons he had. Now, there's some other key people that we kind of discussed. There were other kids. There was other baby mamas. There's some other branches of the tree we're not going to get into on this one, but we'll discuss, okay? Isaac had a brother. Remember, Abraham was with Hagar. They had Ishmael. Okay, and all that confusion and not being under God's grace, we're going to start to see that throughout all the Bible, that whole family tree fights with Isaac's family tree. Okay, Jacob and Esau, they whole family trees fight. Edom couldn't stand Israel. When we look at Edom, when we start reading in the Old Testament, start getting into Kings and Chronicles, we see Israel beefing with Edom. That's Jacob's family tree beefing with Esau's family tree. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yep. And that's I'm going to say that don't happen today. Even in our little small little individuals family, you ever get sisters, hey, this uncle's kids don't like that auntie's kids and stuff like that? History repeats itself. But as you can see, every time we fail, God blesses us. Okay? Even in 12 through 25, Okay? If you kind of follow it, failure. Betrayed your wife, failure. Slept with Hagar, failure. Okay? In 15 and 17, God takes that failure and turns it into he blesses, he restores. Okay? God is faithful to resolve these issues, these mess that we created, and he restores them. We see the same thing in 25 through 36. Okay? Jacob steals from Esau. Failure. Okay? Laban tricks Jacob. They have a whole bunch of kids and a whole bunch of fighting and rivalries. Failure. This family that's supposed to bless the whole world is failing. But then we see in 32 what happens. Jacob wrestles with God. God blesses him. God blesses him and changes his name. God blesses him and changes his name. That finally brings us to the last section, which is where we've been the past 2 weeks. It talks about the 12 sons. In chapter 37, remember, if it ends in 36, we know all these kids are born. He can't have a baby by Rachel. He finally has a baby by Rachel. She has 2 of them. And the first son's name is Joseph. Joseph. Jacob makes a bad parenting mistake, and he shows favoritism to Joseph because that was his first baby by the woman he really loved. And as a result, his brothers really loved him. Seeing if y'all woke. His brothers really what? Hated him. You don't condone hate, but you kind of can't blame him the way Joseph showed all that favoritism to him. So chapter 37, we learned that the brothers hated Joseph. Failure. Seeing that family's failure continue. They ain't supposed to hate nobody. They hated him, couldn't stand him. So much so that what did they do to him? Sold him into slavery. That was in verses 30 or chapter 39 through 40. We see he ends up in slavery and in prison. Joseph's enslaved and in prison. We start to see the shift. Same shift that we see in 12 through 25. In the second half of 25 through 36. That shift of where God takes the failures of his chosen people and starts turning it into a blessing. And often we want to see God come and just make everything right in the blink of an eye and a miracle. But it typically doesn't happen that way. God finds his people in the mess that they've created and begins a path of slow restoration of his family. And what you see in verses 41 through 46, Joseph becomes elevated. And rescues his family. Okay? And that's where we pick up the story. We left in chapter 40 last week. What we start to see in 41 through 46 this week, Joseph becomes elevated and rescues his family. We all know that happened, but now we got to go get the high. Now we got to go get the high. We'll take 10 minutes looking at the high. Okay, once everybody is done right, we're gonna crack open our Bibles and we're gonna jump into 41. We're gonna go get the how. Is this helping y'all? Good. Are we painting a picture? Painting. Lean on my young people right here. I knew Renaya, one of y'all, I'm about to do in youth church. I want y'all to get on your Bible anyway and pop up Genesis 41. Okay, remember these landmarks. Okay, this is what I want you to get in your head and then go back and study these. You know, you don't have to remember exact verses, but no, hey, chapter 37, they hated him. Chapter 39 through 40, he was in prison and enslaved. Chapter 41 through 46, okay, he rose up in the second in command, and he ends up saving his family when they was in a time of hurt. The same family that threw him out, sold him in Egypt. Okay, and when you guys become, don't be intimidated or overwhelmed by people that you see that are good biblical scholars, because you guys have the same power in you. Okay, the same power and ability in you. And my prayer is to unlock that in each and every one of us. Sometimes when you see somebody preaching a study and they go to a verse, they don't remember. Some people do. I'm blessed enough to remember every single verse. But they go through their file cabinet and say, okay, I know this is right around here. Okay, and if you can remember these points, you've created that same file cabinet in your mind. Okay. 12 through 25, that was Abraham. Isaac and Jacob, when it started focusing on, that was in 26 through 36. In 37 through 50, that was all Joseph and the 12 sons. You know what I'm saying? And then you can go a little bit, once you got that down, go a little bit deeper. Okay, now let me look at 12 through 25. All right, this happened there. Betrayed his wife in 12 and 20. Slept with Hagar at 16. Okay, God turned it into a covenant at 15, 17. Okay, they got the circumcision, which that's important because we'll talk about that later. So I need to know that about the circumcision and the sign of the covenant. Then that took us into 25b. Okay, then Isaac came along. What did Isaac do? Isaac came along. He had Jacob and Esau. Okay. But before he had Jacob and Esau, he was sacrificed by Abraham. Okay. He was sacrificed. Okay. Then we had Jacob. Jacob came along. Jacob was a trickster. He deceived. That's the birthright. That whole promise came and he was deceived. He deceived and took that birthright because he was the second son. He wasn't supposed to get it. He was supposed to go to Esau. He tricked Esau. He got the promise. Okay? And then from there, after he tricked Esau, what happened next? He ends up getting tricked in 29. So 27, he tricks Esau. 29 to 41, he got this whole mess with a bunch of baby mama drama, a bunch of kids. And the town was spiral. But in 32, he wrestled with God, and God restored the blessing. In order to maintain the covenant, 32 had to happen. Then it carries on into 37. Those 12 sons of Jacob had 37. Joseph was hated by his brothers because he showed favoritism. Okay. 39 through 41, they sold him into slavery. He was in prison because of something he didn't do. I know 41 through 46, some kind of way, his family ends up in Egypt. He's in power in Egypt, and he saved them from their troubles back in the homeland. Make sense? And that's how you think through it. Okay, that's how you think through it. All right, let's read in 41. Young ladies, when y'all get chapter 41 for me? All right, read it for me. Start at 1. Which version are you looking at? Give me the ESV. And the reason why, depending on the type of study, and we'll get into this some more later, depending on the type of study, that's kind of how I gauge which version I'm using. Okay, if I'm trying to get big picture, I like ESV because it gives you headings that says, okay, this chapter is about this one. English Standard Version, I'm sorry. Got it? Go ahead. What's the heading of chapter 41 say? Yep. Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dreams. You probably didn't scroll all the way around. So we're starting to see how Egypt is delivered. God has blessed him, Joseph, to be able to interpret dreams. Go ahead and read verse 1. Somebody want to pick up verse 5? Who's dreaming again? Pharaoh. Go ahead, verse 6. Yep, keep going all the way through to 9.